Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. It was a cool Mississippi night in April of 1951 as Hattie Lee Barnes was closing down the bar where she worked. The three-quarter moon would have made it lighter outside for anyone creeping up to the roadhouse. She was sleeping there that night to keep an eye on things for her boss, extending her job as maid to overnight caretaker. And she had a gun to defend herself and the bar. But the man who broke through the window near the bed where Hattie Lee was sleeping wasn't there to rob the place. He came for Hattie Lee, and she justifiably defended herself. She immediately called the sheriff. She waited until he got there and fully confessed to what happened. Of course, he still had to take her to jail and charge her as an investigation would be pending. But the danger to Hattie Lee was just beginning, because the man she shot came from the respected Kraft family. And the patriarch, Ed Kraft, would go to any lengths to prove his son was not trying to rape a black woman. Welcome to episode 168, The Trials of Hattie Lee Barnes. As I open today's episode, I want to thank author Trent Brown for again collaborating with me. He wrote a book on the Tina Andrews case, my episode number 87. His book on Tina's case is called Murder in Macomb, the Tina Andrews case. Mr. Brown has a unique ability to pull obscure and yet culturally significant cases from small towns in Mississippi, particularly Macomb, which has its own storied history in the Civil Rights era. Tina's case happened in Macomb, Mississippi, and the tavern where Hattie Lee was forced to defend herself was about 9 miles from Macomb. You will recognize some of the names in this case from Tina's case, specifically Attorney Joe Pygut, who was district attorney by the time of Tina's murder. And I am pretty sure I mispronounced his name the first time. For that, I apologize. He is a hero both in Hattie Lee's case and Tina Andrews. And Trent was kind enough to gently warn me about pronouncing his name right this time. Another familiar figure is Mississippi Governor Hugh White, who released a woman named Ruth Dickens after serving only 6 years for the brutal murder of her mother, Adela Thompson. I covered this case in 2019. It's episode 52. Ruth Dickens came from a wealthy family and had a rich husband who had people in high places that never stopped pushing for her release, and White finally buckled. Governor Hugh White also released a white man early in this case, not believing his life should be ruined for assaulting and trying to kill a black woman. Ironically, right before Hattie's case hit the papers, the murder of Adela Thompson had remained front-page news for a long time. Her murder was in 1949, and her daughter and murderer was a prominent socialite, so it was still front-page news when Hattie Lee's case began. While these murders are not similar, the time period is virtually the same when it comes to politics and race relations, and there are other similarities. There was a fictional black man Ruth Dickens tried to blame for her mother's murder, and there was a real black man in today's case that people tried to pin Lamar Craft's murder on, despite Hattie Lee's confession. If not for the ethical people in the judicial system, an innocent black man very well could have been blamed in both of these cases. And this is where I'm going to warn you about language. There is no way to discuss a case this old and quote from newspapers without using words that are no longer accepted in modern language. As I have said many times before, words matter, and the words used to describe Hattie Lee Barnes certainly mattered then and now. Of all the people I will discuss in this case, Hattie Lee Barnes is the biggest mystery. Even her age seemed up for debate, published as 20, 21, and 25. Trent Brown wrote that she was 21, and he certainly researched her life more than anyone else has. At 21 years old, she was single, had no children, and worked as a maid and caretaker for Rob Lee in his tavern or roadhouse called Lee's Place. In photos, she appears to be a slim young woman with short hair. She lived nearby with her mother and stepfather, Lizzie and Dan McGee. Their home was about 100 yards from Lee's Place, and they both worked for Lee's other business, which was called, quote, Rob Lee's Negro Joint. In the early morning hours of April 17th, Hattie had finished closing up the tavern and had gone to bed. She slept in a small bed in a back room of Lee's place. She was there to watch over the place at night, and her boss had given her a gun for protection. She had been staying overnight in that back room as a caretaker for weeks after an earlier break-in. At around 1:30 a.m., she heard a noise. Someone was coming through the window in the small room near her bed. She grabbed the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver and fired twice as what she described as a figure outlined in the window. She heard a groan, and a man fell through the window onto the bed. After she fired the gun, she yelled out to her stepfather that she had just shot a man and that other men were still outside the bar. While he had not heard the shots, he did hear Hattie Lee call for help, so he ran outside and fired his own gun into the air several times, hoping to scare off the other men. The figure Hattie had fired at was a man named Lamar Craft, of the prominent Craft family of Tylertown, Mississippi. He now lay dead, with a great deal of blood on his face, which seemed to be coming out of his mouth. His father, Ed Craft, had been a candidate for sheriff in the recent Democratic primary. As Trent Brown put it, he was a man with deep roots and connections in Walthall. The family raised cattle and operated the Pure Oil franchise service station. The counties in this story may become confusing. By nature, roadhouses are typically on highways, out of town, so 3 different counties are involved and will be mentioned because of where Lee's place was and where everyone involved worked and lived. Walthall, Pike, and Marion counties are on the southwestern corner of Mississippi that border Louisiana. Tylertown, where the Crafts lived, was in Walthall County. Rob Lee lived in Marion County in the town of Columbia, which will involve yet another shooting in this story. Rob Lee's roadhouse was in Pike County, so the eventual trial for Lamar Craft's murder was held in that county, not in Macomb, the largest town, but in Magnolia, the county seat. I hope I haven't already hopelessly confused you. What is most important to remember is that Hattie Lee Barnes would be going on trial for murder in Mississippi. It wasn't just that she shot a white man. She was facing the death penalty for defending herself. Richard Lamar Craft, the man who had broken into Lee's place that night, was born in 1929 in Mississippi to parents Ed and Gertrude Craft. He was the 4th of 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl. Lamar played football in high school, and after he graduated, he enrolled in the Air Force in 1947. After the Air Force, he attended Mississippi Southern College, where he was a member of Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity. In 1951, Lamar was 22 or 23 years old and was working as a service station operator in Tylertown, the station his family owned. He was also engaged to a woman named Lucy Scott, and they were to be married in June 1951. Despite the circumstances of his death, he was referred to as a tragedy victim in his obituary. The popular son of a prominent man with, quote, a great throng of friends at his funeral, is how the paper described him. And on paper, he was a nice young man. His funeral was at the Methodist Church in Tylertown, in Marion County. He was survived by his father Ed and stepmother Katie, his own mother having died 10 years earlier, as well as his 5 brothers and 1 sister. His family was already trying to control the narrative about Lamar's death. Not that most families would necessarily name their sons attempted rapists in their obituaries, but it was the beginning of the plan that Ed Craft had to clear his son's name, to show the support from his community. What is important to remember for this story is that while the Craft family was framing their narrative, there was plenty of reporting on the real story. One particular reporter and newspaper would take up Hattie Lee's cause, but the story being reported so far was already salacious. On the day after the murder, Wednesday, April 18th, the Clarion Ledger was already running the full story and got off to quite the start. Quote, a Negro maid who shot and killed a white man as he attempted to break into the room in which she was sleeping at 1:30 a.m. Tuesday was later in the morning charged with his murder, according to the county prosecutor. The wording is interesting. The paper knew they had to lead with it being a black woman who shot a white man, but they also were already hinting at what Lamar Craft was trying to do by saying he had broken into the room where she was sleeping. The article goes on to detail the arrest of Craft's two friends who were with him that night, 27-year-old James Easterling and 22-year-old Oscar Hope. They were charged with breaking and entering. And then the story ends with the funeral arrangements of Lamar Craft, set for the next day, Thursday, at 2 p.m., but said that a preliminary hearing had been moved to Friday so it would not conflict with Craft's funeral service. So we've got the county prosecutor, a man named R.B. Reeves, nicknamed Breezy, already giving a full account of the shooting and break-in to the papers. A press release is also not unusual in modern true crime, but maybe some details would have been held back for trial. But in this case, Hattie Lee Barnes had already confessed in full to the sheriff, and Easterling and Hope had already told their stories as well. And their story was that on the evening of April 16th, Lamar Craft, James Easterling, and Oscar Hope went to Rob Lee's tavern at around 9 p.m. and stayed until closing time, drinking whiskey and beer until well after midnight. Lamar Craft and Rob Lee were actually said to be good friends, and Lamar was a regular customer of the tavern. The three men left the tavern in Lamar's car and drove east towards Tylertown before turning around and going back to the tavern. James later testified that Lamar said he was going back to the tavern to see Hattie Lee. Oscar confirmed this and said they all knew that Hattie Lee was still in the tavern when they went back. On the way there, they passed Rob Lee and his wife in their separate cars as they left the tavern for the night. When they got to the tavern, they parked the car in the back, out of sight from the road, and then they knocked on the front and back doors and looked through the shutters. While looking through the windows, Oscar said he saw Hattie, illuminated by light coming from the window in the back room. When she didn't open the door, they went to the back of the tavern to the window of the back room. Lamar told Oscar to go to the front of the tavern and keep watch, at which point Oscar said he warned him not to go inside because, quote, she probably has a gun. But Oscar said Lamar wouldn't listen, instead saying he was going inside to have sex with Hattie Lee. Obviously, these were not his exact words, but it would be a long time before the real words came out. James and Oscar claimed they did not know that Hattie Lee slept in the back room, and that while Lamar knew what he wanted to do, they didn't really have a plan once they got back to the tavern. But they did as Lamar Craft instructed. Oscar went around front to stand watch as James and Lamar opened the back window of the tavern. James was holding the window open for Lamar to crawl through when the shots rang out. After Lamar was shot, James dropped the window and ran. Oscar, the lookout, also ran off, running as soon as he heard the shots. James caught up to Oscar quickly, and they ran about a mile to the home of a man they knew and told him they had been in a car wreck and asked to use his phone. They then used the phone to call a taxi to take them to the sheriff's department, where they arrived at around 3 a.m. and reported the shooting to the deputies. Hattie Lee had immediately called the sheriff, a man named Robert E. Lee, at his home to report that she had shot someone at Lee's place and that she would stay there and wait for him. Side note, I want to point out for any listeners who are not from the States that it's not unusual to hear different men named Robert E. Lee or some variation, like Rob Lee, in older stories from the South. He was a general who became chief commander of the Confederate Army during our Civil War, so it was a common name in the South. For people from the States, I apologize for the history lesson, but I know our neighbors appreciate it. When Sheriff Lee found out that James and Oscar had gone to the station to report the shooting, he had an officer escort them back to the crime scene, and then they were later taken into custody at the Pike County Jail. Hattie Lee surrendered to the sheriff, but he later said that, quote, he had a difficult time making the woman understand who he was so she would let him enter. She was clearly rattled, probably terrified. Once she surrendered, the sheriff had officers take her to the jail for her protection. Those were the words used before she was charged. At the tavern, Lamar Craft was found dead and lying across a single bed near the window. He had fallen headfirst through the window after he was shot, and the window fell down and held him there as James dropped it and ran away. As I said, there was a lot of blood on his face and mouth, so it was initially believed that Lamar had been shot in the mouth, and that this was the shot that killed him. The second bullet went past him and into his car, which was parked behind him. The bullet was later found lodged in the car. Lamar's father, Ed Kraft, was also called to the tavern that night. This is obviously not something that would happen today. The father of a shooting victim would not be allowed into the scene. No one besides police would be allowed into an active crime scene. But this was 1951, and Ed Kraft was a well-known, respected man in Walthall County who had just run for sheriff the previous summer. As soon as officers realized it was his son, he was called. It would have been a common courtesy. Later that day, Hattie Lee Barnes was officially charged with Lamar Kraft's murder. At the same time, James Easterling and Oscar Hope were charged with breaking and entering. Author Trent Brown asked the question on all of our minds in his book, why was she charged with murder and not manslaughter or some other lesser offense? Not only had she confessed to what happened, James and Oscar had supported her story and gave Lamar's motive, that he intended to have sex with her. Mr. Brown's answer was, quote, Pike County authorities charged Barnes with murder, perhaps to forestall any inclination among local whites to take justice into their own hands. He goes on to point out that vigilante justice was not as prominent in the early 50s as it had been decades before in the area, but the threat remained real, as he put it. On Thursday, April 19th, Hattie was placed on a $1,000 bond, and her case was approved to go before a grand jury. James and Oscar were also put on $1,000 bonds for their breaking and entering charges, and their cases were sent to a grand jury. $1,000 would be a little over $11,000 in 2022 money. Both men were immediately released on the promise that they would return to pay their bond. Despite her bond being set in Pike County, which she couldn't afford anyway, Hattie Lee was moved from the Pike County Jail to the Tylertown Jail in Walthall County for what was called protective custody. But she was held there for a more insidious reason that I will get into in a moment. At the preliminary hearing on the 19th, it was revealed that Lamar had not been shot in the mouth, but in the shoulder. The manager of the funeral home, where Lamar's body had been embalmed, revealed that the bullet hit Lamar in the shoulder, traveled into his chest, and lodged itself in his lower spine. Sheriff Lee testified that Lamar's body was not properly examined at the scene, and that there was a lot of blood on Lamar's face, leading officers to conclude that he had been shot in the face. At around 4:30 on the day of the 19th, a man named J.C. Henson paid Hattie's bond, and she was taken to the Pike courthouse to sign the bond document. A sheriff's deputy released Hattie Lee to J.C. Henson and another man who she later said was a private detective named Roberts. The group then went to a service station in Macomb, and one of the men made a call to Tylertown. Hattie Lee asked to be let out of the car when they got close to her home, but the men refused, instead taking her back to Tylertown. That would be where the Kraft family lived. Once in Tylertown, Hattie was taken to the office of a lawyer named Breed Munger. He represented the Kraft family. There were other men in the office, including Ed Kraft, Lamar's dad, and his brothers. Hattie was told she could go to the electric chair for shooting Lamar and was urged to change her story. Charles Gordon, the newspaper man I told you would take up Hattie Lee's cause, reported that she was held in this office until 4 a.m., and that even the Pike County prosecutor, R.B. Reeves, showed up to the office for this informal questioning. Imagine being Hattie Lee Barnes, a young black woman, already charged with murder, being held in an office by a group of powerful white men, all of them telling her to change her story, including the prosecutor in her case. She eventually relented and said it was Rob Lee, the owner of the tavern, who shot Lamar Kraft. The men called the Walthall prosecutor to take Hattie Lee's new statement for the record. Then she was returned to the Walthall County Jail at around 4 a.m. The Walthall sheriff drove Hattie Lee Barnes back to Pike County, where she was met by Sheriff Lee. Hattie would soon talk to reporter Charles Gordon about her ordeal, but just the handoff alone was foreboding. The Walthall sheriff told her to keep her head down as he drove her over the Pike County line. Then Sheriff Lee, in Pike County, drove her to a place to stay in what was known as the center of Black Macomb, a safe place to stay. The cooperation of the two sheriffs says a lot. It's unclear if Hattie understood her rights, but she had already asked the men who bonded her out to take her home. Instead, she was taken to the office of a powerful Tylertown lawyer who represented the Kraft family. It's likely she understood, but felt it was safer to not try and resist. And she already knew what the Kraft family wanted her to say, that Rob Lee had shot their son, not her. Hattie Lee told the reporter that at one point she was even driven around Marion County to look for a black man named Leroy Collins, who was reported to be near the tavern on the night of the shooting. But she did not point out the man, though you will hear his name again. This reminds me of when Ruth Dickens was allowed out of prison to go look for the imaginary black man she blamed for killing her mother. She was actually taken to a mental institution and did point out a 16-year-old black kid who thankfully had a rock-solid alibi. Hattie Lee later said that while she was not physically harmed in Tylertown, she was scared to death, and she did change her story due to this fear. She said that she told the men anything they wanted. But as soon as she was back in Pike County, she reversed her story back to the truth. She had shot Lamar Kraft, not Rob Lee. But it didn't matter. The Kraft family had their story brewing, and a couple of Kraft brothers were about to take matters into their own hands. On May 9th, Rob Lee was getting into his pickup truck outside of his home on the Walthall-Marion County line when he was ambushed. Vernon and Milo Kraft, two of Lamar's brothers, shot him as they drove by. They sprayed his truck with pistols and shotguns. Lee dove to the floor of his truck and wasn't struck by any of the bullets or pellets, but a piece of glass from the windows did cut his eye. The sheriff of Marion County responded and later reported that there were 42 bullet holes in Lee's truck and that he was lucky to be alive, and he may not be able to see out of one eye. Vernon and Milo Kraft were both arrested and charged with assault and battery with intent to kill. Both brothers were released on $2,000 bonds. Lee was in the hospital for a few days, needing an operation to remove the glass from his eye, but he did recover. And he had a plan of his own. Hattie Lee Barnes had left the Pike County area for Leland, Mississippi, about 200 miles north in Washington County. Ironically, Leland is also Ruth Dickens' hometown. But Hattie had been led there by Rob Lee. It is unclear how that went down, but she had plenty of reason to want to hide far away from this madness, especially after what the Kraft family had done to Rob Lee. She had had her own run-in with the family, which, although may have seemed formal at a lawyer's office, was still frightening. And now the Kraft brothers were shooting at people. And if you think about it, she may have trusted Rob Lee. He had been her employer. And despite the machinations of the Kraft family and members of law enforcement and the court, Hattie Lee Barnes had told the truth in a very public way, that she had shot Lamar Kraft, not Rob Lee. So when Rob Lee came to get her on June 12th, she may have felt no reason to fear him. But then he took her for a ride, stopping at a roadhouse to have some drinks, where he met up with a black man named Walter Watson. She, Walter, and Rob Lee would ride around for the next 2 days, ostensibly on their way back to Pike County, stopping to get whiskey as they drove, and the mood growing more ominous for Hattie Lee. They mainly stayed around Marion County, near Rob Lee's home, where he would go in to sleep those 2 nights, leaving Hattie Lee and Walter to sleep in the car. At one juke joint, the men were drinking early times whiskey, and Hattie was probably getting more and more nervous. Walter was up and around, socializing, and going to the jukebox to play music, so he didn't hear everything that was said, but he later testified that he heard Rob Lee say to Hattie that he would blow her brains out. Lee was clearly threatening his former employee. Maybe he was just telling her if she changed her story the way the Kraft family wanted her to, he would have to kill her. She did leave willingly with him again. It's hard to say what Hattie was thinking or feeling other than fear. She didn't ask for help anywhere or try to escape, but that's how she had behaved all during this long waking nightmare. She went along and kept her head down, and so far it had kept her safe. But she was in much more danger from Rob Lee than she realized. On the last evening she was with the two men, Rob Lee drove her to a tenant cabin on his land in Marion County where a bootlegger lived. But then he marched her back behind the cabin. There, he shot her 3 times. Hattie begged him to call a doctor or take her to the hospital, but he walked away. And then Walter Watson walked up to her, and she begged him to leave her alone, but he shot her twice more, once in the face. Watson would later say he tried to miss Hattie, but that was probably a lie. What was the truth was what he said about Rob Lee's demeanor that night. Trent Brown wrote that Watson described Lee as volatile and violent. He insisted that Watson help him, and Watson said he was afraid of Rob Lee. Hattie Lee Barnes was shot in the head, shoulder, abdomen, and arm, but still managed to get up and walk towards the nearby highway after the shooters fled. And it was Rob Lee's wife who saw Hattie and took her to the hospital, where she had emergency surgery and was in critical condition. Some people were confused by Mrs. Rob Lee's help of Hattie until Charles Gordon reported that she was the estranged wife of Rob Lee. It's possible she knew nothing about what her estranged husband was up to and just saw a mortally injured woman and helped her. I think that is much more likely, but who's to say? Hattie made a statement to the Marion County Sheriff and Attorney Breed Munger from her hospital room about the attack. She said that Rob Lee and a black man named Walter Watson were responsible. Why the attorney for the Kraft family was continuously allowed in on formal questioning is still a mystery, except that this informal cooperation between local attorneys and law enforcement was common, as I've already demonstrated. But it doesn't make it right. He had clearly tried to intimidate her. Rob Lee had shot Hattie in the shoulder, abdomen, and arm with a snub-nosed pistol and then walked away. Walter Watson shot her 2 times with what she described as Rob's regular pistol. Affidavits were filed against Lee and Watson in Marion County, and they were both charged with assault and battery and intent to murder. They were both apprehended and arrested in the days following the shooting. Walter Watson went on trial in less than 2 weeks after the shooting. Hattie was the star witness in the trial, limping into court with a bandage on her face to testify. The road trip had begun on June 12th and had ended on June 14th, but before Hattie was taken and shot, they had stopped at a bar in Marion County. The owner of that bar, a woman named Ernestine James, testified that Hattie, Rob, Walter, and another man were at her place at around 2:30 p.m., and that they bought several half-pints of whiskey. The group then went outside and started practicing firing their pistols. Ernestine claimed to have heard Rob say he had to get rid of Hattie Lee. The group then went to visit a bootlegger, which was at the tenant cabin where Hattie Lee was shot. Walter testified in his own defense and stated that he was in the car when he heard 3 gunshots and Hattie cry, "Oh Lord." He said he waited in the car until Rob came back and told him to go kill Hattie. After shooting her, Walter returned to Rob, who was waiting in the car, and told him, "We got her." The third testimony came from the chief of police of Columbia, the town where Hattie Lee was shot. He said that after he was arrested, Walter told him that he was hired to drive Rob's car home. Walter told the sheriff that he had heard Rob threaten Hattie on the trip. He also testified that Walter claimed to have tried to miss Hattie Lee when he shot at her, but he failed. On June 26th, after deliberating for only 25 minutes, a jury convicted Walter Watson as guilty of assault and battery with intent to kill. He was sentenced to 10 years. Walter appealed his conviction, but in December of 1951, it was upheld by the Mississippi Supreme Court. Rob Lee's trial was scheduled to start on June 27th, right after Walter Watson's, but he failed to appear despite being out on bond. A judge issued a bench warrant for his arrest and set a new bond of $10,000. He had previously been out on a $2,500 bond, the highest one yet in this case. But that $10,000 would be about $114,000 in 2022 money. Rob Lee had attended most of Walter's trial and was believed to have left sometime during the night of the 26th after Walter was convicted. Officers believed that he had left in a light blue 2-door Mercury car. The Mississippi State Highway Patrol were notified of Rob Lee's escape and told to keep an eye out for him. They were also asked to inform state police throughout the U.S. South and U.S. Border Patrol on the Mexican border. On July 14th, Rob Lee surrendered to deputy sheriffs in Marion County. He said that he hadn't left the county, and even though he had skipped out on bond already, he was released on the new $10,000 bond. Then, despite all of this, Hattie Lee Barnes was still formally indicted for the murder of Lamar Craft on October 2nd, 1951. Hattie Lee's trial began on October 24th, 1951, in the Magnolia Courthouse in Pike County. She was represented by two court-appointed attorneys, Joe Paget and George Cutrer. One of her attorneys, Joe Paget, grew to be a very respected member of the community. He was born in 1925 in Walthall County, Mississippi. He attended Macomb High School and then attended Southwest Mississippi Junior College. During World War II, he volunteered for military service and was an intelligence officer in Europe. This job required him to parachute behind enemy lines, where he acted as a spy and destroyed bridges and was even imprisoned by Nazi SS. All of this happening before he was 20 years old. He also fought at the Battle of the Bulge and was in the mob in Milan, Italy that hung the body of Benito Mussolini, and then he ordered the mob to take the body down and go away. After Eisenhower became president, Joe was fond of reminding people, "I was in the army with Eisenhower." After the war, he attended law school at the University of Mississippi and started practicing law in 1953. He married a woman named Lorraine, and they had 5 children together. Joe started his career as a Pike County attorney and then as the DA for Pike, Walthall, Lincoln, and Copiah counties. As I told you at the beginning of the episode, he was the district attorney who prosecuted the men accused of murdering Tina Andrews. Again, that is episode 87, my other collaboration with author Trent Brown. At the time of Hattie Lee's arrest and indictment in 1951, Joe Paget was the youngest and newest attorney in Pike County. He was only 25 years old. And that's how it went for court-appointed attorneys then, though there was supposedly a fair pool to choose from. As Trent pointed out in his book, it was usually the youngest and most inexperienced attorneys who were assigned as public defenders, simply because the older, more seasoned lawyers were the busiest. What makes Joe Paget remarkable is not just what he will do for Hattie at trial, it's what he did not do before the trial. Trent also spoke about this in his book, but I'm sure a lot of you can already guess. He did not pressure Hattie Lee Barnes to take a plea deal. Many attorneys would probably have counseled a black woman who had confessed to shooting a white man to take a plea and avoid the death penalty. Even modern defense attorneys advise pleas for all kinds of reasons, but especially if the person on trial has confessed. But Paget made the decision to take Hattie Lee's case to trial and probably had his strategy already prepared. When picking a jury, both the prosecutor and Paget asked the question, would the fact that the defendant is a black woman and the slaying victim a white man affect your verdict in this trial? All of the jurors said they would not let this affect their judgment. Testimonies in the trial included that of Sheriff Robert E. Lee, Oscar Hope, and James Easterling. As Trent Brown pointed out in his book, for all the times Hattie Lee had to tell her story, she did not have to tell it at her own trial. The same day the trial began, it ended. Without calling any witnesses, Joe Paget made a motion to the judge, Thomas Brady, to instruct the jury to acquit Hattie Lee Barnes because she acted in self-defense. He even invoked what we think of as the castle doctrine, because testimony had shown that Hattie Lee had been sleeping in the tavern to watch over it at night for weeks before. Much has been made over this motion and the judge's decision, mostly because Judge Brady was a well-known segregationist. But the truth is, as Trent Brown also pointed out, and as many of you probably know, any good defense attorney is constantly making motions all throughout a trial, particularly a motion to dismiss after the state rests, or a motion to instruct the jury. Now, these motions don't always work, but they are common. So common, I rarely mention them in many cases. There are no existing transcripts in Hattie Lee's trial, and we do not know exactly what Joe Paget said to the judge, but as Mr. Brown wrote, whatever he said worked. Considering the testimony of the sheriff and Lamar Craft's two friends who were helping him that evening, it would not have been too hard for the judge to see that Hattie Lee Barnes had a right to defend herself and or the property she was guarding. The jury did as the judge instructed, and Hattie Lee was freed. After her acquittal, she married a man named Leon Gardner under an assumed name. They moved to Arkansas and became tenant farmers on a cotton farm. But the Craft family was still trying to posthumously clear Lamar's name, and somehow, on March 15th, 1952, a man named Leroy Collins was charged and arrested for the murder of Lamar Craft. This is the same man who Hattie Lee was taken to look for while she was held in Tylertown in April of 1951 with the Craft family, their attorney, and even the prosecutor who were pressuring her to say Rob Lee shot Lamar. It would seem that in place of Rob Lee, they were looking for a black man to pin it on. Leroy worked for Rob Lee's tavern and had given a statement saying that on the night of Lamar's death, he was given a ride home by Rob Lee after the tavern closed. He claimed that he didn't even know about Lamar's death until 2 days after it happened. On March 21st, the affidavit against him was dismissed due to a lack of prosecution. A bond was set at $750 because Leroy was considered a material witness, but he was unable to post it and stayed in jail until around April 1st, when he was released. On June 3, 1953, Hattie was taken into custody by Arkansas officers. It's not clear if she avoided a court order, but we do know the officers knew where she was because her mother came to visit her. She was given an extradition order to sign to go back to Mississippi. She couldn't read it, but it didn't matter. She never argued with authorities. They had come to get her to testify at Rob Lee's trial for when he almost shot her to death. She was taken first to the Columbia jail before being moved to the Marion County jail. She had done nothing wrong. A jury had found her not guilty by reason of self-defense in Lamar Craft's death. And now she was held as a material witness in a trial for her own attempted murder. Most witnesses are put up in hotels as they wait to testify, particularly the victims. But Hattie Lee sat in jail as she waited 2 weeks for the trial to start. Rob Lee's trial finally started on June 17, 1953. There were only 2 testimonies in the trial, that of Hattie Lee and Walter Watson. They repeated what they had said in previous trials and hearings. That same day, June 17th, a jury deliberated for 5 minutes and found Rob Lee guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Then, Hattie Lee Barnes was still kept in jail even after she testified in Rob Lee's trial on charges of obstructing justice and as a material witness. I don't understand the obstruction of justice part, but wait till you hear what trial she was expected to testify in. On June 17, 1953, the DA filed an affidavit charging Rob Lee with killing Lamar Craft. Ed Craft had finally gotten his way. On July 20th, 1953, Rob Lee was arrested and charged with the murder of Lamar Craft. At the time of the arrest, Rob Lee had been free on bond while his assault conviction was being appealed. Shortly after his arrest, he was freed on a bond of $7,500. And yet, Hattie Lee Barnes still sat in jail just because she was a material witness. She had already been found not guilty in her own criminal trial, and Rob Lee had been found guilty of shooting her, but he was out on bond, and now she was in jail waiting to testify against him for shooting Lamar Craft. It is mind-boggling. In mid-July, Hattie's attorney, Joe Paget, the man who had represented her throughout all of the court proceedings so far, filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus under the claims that Hattie Lee was being falsely and unfairly imprisoned. A statement in the petition also mentioned Hattie's past treatment by law enforcement and that she had been forced to sign statements that she knew were false. This made people suspicious that Hattie Lee had changed her story once again and was claiming to not be Lamar Craft's shooter. On July 14th, Joe's petition was dismissed, and Hattie Lee's bond was set to remain at $2,500. In the decision to dismiss the case, it was ruled that Hattie's imprisonment was lawful, and some of her statements were labeled as contradictory. Despite their contradictory statements, when she testified in a hearing for the petition, she once again stated that she had killed Lamar Craft. During these proceedings, it was revealed that on June 18, 1953, while imprisoned, Hattie Lee had signed a statement saying that Lamar had been killed by someone other than her and his body was placed in the tavern where it had been found. Hattie Lee later said in the hearing that she had only signed the statement because she was tired and afraid. Joe Paget appealed the decision immediately. During this time, Hattie Lee was moved between jails several times. She told reporter Charles Gordon that she didn't feel afraid in jail, but that she preferred the Brookhaven jail to others because, quote, "At Brookhaven, I could look out the window, and here, there's not any window I can look out of." She just sadly seemed to accept her fate. In total, Hattie Lee Barnes had been in 3 different jails: the Marion County Jail in Columbia, the Lincoln County Jail in Brookhaven, and the Pike County Jail in Magnolia, and briefly in Arkansas State custody. Also brought during these proceedings was a suit filed in Walthall County Circuit Court on July 18, 1953 by Ed Craft. The suit was filed against the American National Insurance Company. Ed Craft filed the suit saying that his son's death was accidental and he should get $2,000, which would be over $22,000 today. He had already been paid $1,000 by the insurance company. Ironically, Joe Paget represented the insurance company in this case, which, since he knew the case backwards and forwards, put him in a very good position. Interestingly, the Craft family attorney, Breed Munger, grilled James Easterling about Lamar Craft's intentions that April night. At this time, he was more explicit. He said that Lamar said, quote, "I'm going to screw that Negro girl." He had first said they were going to see Hattie Lee, but as Munger hounded him, he finally told the truth. Then, when Munger accused him of changing his story, lying at this time, Easterling insisted he wasn't changing his story, but, quote, "Mr. Munger, I wasn't coming out in plain words and say it until I was forced to. I tell you the reason why I didn't tell it. The truth is, after the boy was killed, I didn't want to tell the reason he went back. He had a good name. That is the reason I didn't tell exactly why he went back there. He didn't want to ruin Lamar Craft's good name and Hattie Lee's trial or his own criminal trial. But now he had been badgered into telling the truth by the Craft family lawyer. Yes, and maybe he didn't want to ruin his own good name either." Still, on August 12, 1953, Ed Craft was granted the additional $1,000 by a jury. This trial was also tried before Judge Thomas Brady, and this time he denied Joe Paget's request for a directed verdict, and the jury ruled in favor of the powerful Ed Craft. However, the Supreme Court of Mississippi disagreed with the decision in favor of American National on the grounds that the plaintiff, Ed Craft, had to prove the shooting was accidental. The court found that Lamar Craft was shot to prevent the commission of a burglary, which is a felony, meaning Hattie Lee Barnes shot him on purpose, not by accident, which is what the Craft family was trying to prove to get an additional $1,000. No one really believes it was about the money, though. It was always about trying to make Lamar Craft's death about anything other than him trying to break into a tavern to have sex with a black woman. The court further found that the imminent danger of a great personal injury to Barnes afforded justification for her to fire the fatal shot. Or, as Trent Brown put it, twice now, the state of Mississippi ruled that Hattie Lee Barnes had the right to defend herself with lethal force. Then on September 13, 1953, the Enterprise Journal, led by reporter Charles Gordon, announced that a group of white Macomb citizens were coming together to raise money to pay for Hattie's $2,500 bond. At that point, she had been in jail for 3.5 months as a material witness. The people who formed the group did so because they believed that the due process of the law should apply even to the least influential. Together, the group formed the Hattie Lee Barnes Trust Fund. Publisher J.O. Emmerich told the Clarion Ledger that, quote, "The people felt it unfair for the woman to remain in jail, charged with no crime, until such time as the state called her as a witness." In order to get Hattie released, the group collected donations or pledges for $5 or $10. The goal was to get enough signatures and pledges that the sheriff would be forced to recognize the money as bond money and release Hattie. The next day, September 16th, Hattie's bond was lowered to $500. On September 18th, Hattie was finally released from jail. 100 prominent citizens of Macomb gave $5 to the fund so Hattie could be released. Following her release, Hattie was given a bus ticket and the option to leave the city if she wished. She ended up leaving, but made a promise to return in October if her presence was needed by the grand jury that would be convening at that time to go over the new murder charges against Rob Lee. On October 15, 1953, a grand jury was heard for the murder charges against Rob Lee, and Hattie returned as promised to testify. During this testimony, she repeated her confession of shooting and killing Lamar Craft. Let me repeat all of that. After having gone on trial for her own life and being found not guilty for the murder of Lamar Craft, then being shot at and almost killed, she had testified against her shooters, and then she had been held in jail for months just as a material witness, and yet she still returned to exonerate the man who had shot her. She still came back and told the truth. The grand jury did not indict Rob Lee. The $7,500 bond in Lee's case was dismissed because there was now no reason to call him back to court. Hattie Lee's remaining $500 bond was also dismissed because there was no need for her to testify in a potential trial. After it was all over and she was finally released, there isn't much, if any, record of her life. She disappeared, perhaps going back to Arkansas with her husband. We don't know if she had any children or what became of her. On the one hand, I am sad that I don't have loving quotes about her from her children or grandchildren. I would love to have a quote about her laugh or warm smile. The only photos we have of her were taken in jail, and she certainly wasn't smiling. But on the other hand, I am glad she was able to fade into obscurity, because it's obvious that is what she wanted. In March of 1954, Rob Lee's appeal on his assault and battery and intent to kill conviction was denied, and his conviction and 10-year sentence were upheld. After his conviction was upheld, Rob Lee ran yet again. The Assistant Attorney General then went to Columbia to collect forfeitures on Lee's bond. His bondsmen were forced to pay off the money, $5,000. That's over $55,000 in 2022 dollars. On March 13th, Rob was located at a local hospital where he was in critical condition from stomach hemorrhages. While in the hospital, he was kept under heavy guard. There's no explanation about the stomach hemorrhages, but if I had to guess, it would be an ulcer, which is the most common cause of upper GI bleeding. Lee was released after 5 days into custody at the Marion County Jail, and then he was processed into state custody at Parchman on May 1st, 1954. But he served just over a year of his 10-year sentence when in July of 1955, Mississippi Governor Hugh White granted Lee a 90-day suspension of sentence. By September, he was granted an indefinite suspension of his sentence. And remember, Governor White would be the same governor who released Ruth Dickens after only 6 years for the brutal murder of her mother. For what it's worth, Walter Watson only served about half of his 10-year sentence. But after his parole, he didn't have the audacity to ask for a full pardon like Rob Lee did in 1959. He petitioned then-Governor J.P. Coleman for the pardon because, as he put it, he had been a law-abiding citizen for several years. He didn't get that pardon, and it does seem he lived the rest of his life out of trouble and died at the ripe old age of 75. It pains me to point this out, but to be fair, Rob Lee would never have shot Hattie Lee Barnes, much less skipped bond and behaved the way he did, if it wasn't for Ed Kraft and his friends and family doing everything they could to be sure that Rob went down for shooting Lamar Craft. And why? They never actually gave an alternate theory, except that I guess it would be better for their golden boy to be considered a common burglar than a man intent on raping a black woman. And that is the dirty word you will never read about in this case. As the years of reporting went on, Charles Gordon for the Enterprise Journal did get more explicit about Lamar Craft's intentions, but it was still a time period for euphemisms and innuendo, not words like rape or sexual assault. No one ever framed what happened in this case in terms of an attempted sexual assault or attempted rape. Oscar Hope and James Easterling said Lamar Craft planned to break into that bar to have sex with Hattie Lee, as if, once he was inside, she would just comply. Or maybe worse, they intended to join in. Maybe Lamar was a bully, a ringleader who made his friends help. Or maybe they just covered their own asses when they reported the shooting. Remember, James was holding the window open for Lamar. He was doing more than just acting as a lookout. Author Trent Brown never really questioned the motives of three drunk young white men returning to a bar after hours to go see a young black woman. He felt it was pretty obvious. So do I. And I've done a lot of thinking about the heroes in this case. Joe Pygott worked hard for Hattie Lee Barnes, and he went on to become a very well-respected district attorney who always fought for good. Reporter Charles Gordon insisted on covering Hattie Lee's case, which, while salacious in the beginning, might have dropped out of the headlines if he had not cared, if he had not kept pushing his editor. His coverage spurred the citizens of Macomb to raise Hattie Lee's bond, to see her as they would see a white woman being held illegally. And Gordon's language changed over time. He never called Hattie Lee a girl, as a black woman would often have been called then, and he stopped using the word negress early on, though he did still write Negro woman, which was the typical language used. If it happened a decade later, he and other newspapers would have called Hattie Lee a colored woman. And Joe Pygott did not just collect his small fee, which was $75 as public defender, and push Hattie Lee Barnes to take a plea deal, although it may have been the safest bet for her at the time. But he not only believed in her, he believed in his own ability as a lawyer and his respect for the law. He believed that Judge Brady, despite his views on segregation, would respect the law. It was a gamble, but he won. Joe Pygott is most certainly a hero in this case. But the biggest hero of all is Hattie Lee Barnes herself. All through the trials, even after being nearly shot to death, she always had the courage to go to court and tell the truth. She was given the opportunity to blame the shooting on Rob Lee and go free, but she insisted on telling the truth and went on trial for Lamar Craft's murder. Not manslaughter, but murder, under the fear of the death penalty. She was illiterate and therefore unable to understand the many papers put in front of her to sign, some of them false statements, but she was a smart woman. She knew inherently what was in those papers, but she knew when to keep her head down and sign whatever they wanted and say whatever she had to stay safe. But when she went to court, she always told the truth. She had nothing to hide. And while the state of Mississippi did twice say that she had the right to defend herself, no one ever really addressed the fact that she could have been raped. She was never treated as a victim, not even in the trials for her own attempted murder. Instead, she was held in jail as a witness while the man who shot her walked free on bond. I wonder if anyone ever really thought about the true terror Hattie Lee may have felt that April night in 1951, when she knew men were breaking into the tavern where she was alone. She knew what they wanted, what they really wanted. Hattie Lee Barnes did not shoot Lamar Craft to protect whatever cash was left in the till, or to protect Rob Lee's liquor. She shot him to protect herself. She knew she was in danger, and once she knew she had killed a white man, she knew she was in even more danger, but she didn't run. She called the sheriff and told the truth. She risked her own life to tell the truth, and continued to do so at great personal cost, until finally, the state of Mississippi left her in peace. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by me with the help of Trent Brown's amazing book, Roadhouse Justice, Hattie Lee Barnes and the Killing of a White Man in 1950s Mississippi. This is the second time I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Trent. I greatly admire his work and hope you will read his book. There is no way I could have covered all the details of this incredible case, much less all the nuances of the time period, specifically in Mississippi, the way Trent Brown has. I will have a link to his book in today's show notes. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and go to the listener suggestion tab. It's the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. And please remember, I do not accept suggestions on social media private messaging. But please do come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, and now Amazon and Audible. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.